learning to look at abstract expressionism. Here we go. Okay, so the first artist that we're looking at is Jackson Pollock, right? And he belongs to a group of abstract expressionists. I might fill you in. They started to reach their mature style in the very late 1940s or the early 1950s. And it was a whole group of artists. Many of them were centered in New York. So the abstract expressionists are often called the New York School as well, right? But their work is not it's not uniform. There's a lot of variations in the artists who were called abstract expressionists. Some of them, like Jackson Pollock, were called action painters or gesture painters, and we'll look at a couple of those first. Besides Jackson Pollock was his wife, Lee Krasner. She also was a gesture painter, and living close by in Springs, you would find William De Kooning. Right? So these artists were considered the action painters. On the other side of this scale, we see artists like Mark Rothko, whose work has a very different feel to it. You don't really get the sense of the motion or anything like that. We'll see that he does delve deeply into the paint as well, but mostly it's in these broad bands of color. And Barnett Newman as well, right? Working in what came to be known as color field. So these are the kind of opposite ends of what we call abstract expressionism. And there were artists that were in the middle as well, you know, so there was some, it was hard to say whether they were abstract, whether they were action painters or color field painters. Robert Motherwell, for instance, was one of those whose work fell somewhere in between the two extremes. This work, by the way, Elegy to the Spanish Republic, is, although it's meant to be abstract, it has very deep content, which we'll come back to later on. Some people think that because a work has nothing recognizable in it, that it has no meaning, and that's far from the case. Many of the artists who work in abstract expressionism feel like their work is filled with content, right? But it's on a different level, and we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so anyway, that's just a smattering of the art, the people who are considered abstract expressionists. Helen Frankenthaler, by the way, is almost a generation younger than all of the others that we've looked at. See, she's born in 1928. Some of the others were born in the 1900s or early teens. So she came a little bit later, and her story would be appreciably different than the others, you know, the others who had been children during World War I and were, you know, adults during the Great Depression, would have a different story than Helen Frankenthaler. We'll talk a little bit about some of their stories coming up. Okay, so around 1949, 1950, this movement took on a lot of steam. And in the United States, Jackson Pollock was elevated to being considered, well, the greatest living painter in the United States, right? He was considered, you know, the hero of American individualism at that time. And he was sponsored by a lot of pro-America cultural groups, right? So it was kind of odd to see that this style of work that was so very inaccessible to uneducated art people, right, would become so important, right? And it's an interesting story of how this art came to be. Aside from how it became to be important, right? It became important because of the Cold War, right? In the Cold War, the United States, and this is where we talked politics last time, the United States was standing up to the Soviet Union militarily, but also culturally. And we wanted to show that our culture, was the superior culture. Now, in Russia, Soviet Union, you found the greatest, performers, the pianists, the violinists, the composers, the ballerinas, right? They were all coming out of the Soviet Union because of that very strict way in which people studied there. Right. And then to counter that, we had the United States, the rugged individuals, the time of John Wayne, and Jackson Pollock just fit right into that. Right. So he became this kind of lone wolf artist who who worked to his own muse, which was like the way America should be, or the way we tried to promote America at that time, right? So this is the late 40s and early 50s. And how did this come from an art of the 1930s and early 40s that in the United States was very different in character? Grant Wood's work from 1930, American Gothic, is part of a long series of works of social realism. In this case, we could even call it propaganda, about the greatness of America, let's say, right? And here we have these examples of this couple who are very stoic, and they work, and they're very serious about their farming endeavor. And this was what was being promoted in 1930. I must remind you that that was the beginning of the Great Depression, and we saw most of Americans thought that the crash of the stock market and the depression was because of events happening in Europe. So we felt like we needed to separate ourselves and pull back, and hence we have American Gothic, right? Through the next decade, we enter into World War II, and of course we have this other very heroic form, Rosie the Riveter, right? The thing that they both have in common is that they're both narratives, they're both very realistic, right, forms of art, right? And this is the antithesis to what we're looking at when we look at abstract expressionism. So in 1930, Jackson Pollock and some of the others were already, mature people in their 20s and beginning their art careers. And this is the world in which they began making art, right? So although those types of art were most popular, there was still a small group of abstract artists in the United States. There were originally the abstract artists formed around Alfred Stieglitz rather, and in the first 15 or 20 years of the 20th century, he had an important gallery that showed abstraction in the United States. Almost all of them had gone to Europe to study and learn from other abstract artists. The first who didn't was Georgia O'Keeffe, right? And as we move into the 20s and into the 30s, we see a kind of a fading of the interest in abstract art in the United States, except for this very small group of people, right? Stuart Davis was one of those artists who really bridged the gap from the Stieglitz school all the way until the 1960s, and is really influential in the pop movement as well too. Now, Bergen Diller has a different role to play. He's a very abstract artist. His work is rooted in constructivism, which was a European form of geometric art. And what he had that was most important during the Depression, there were artists who got paid through the WPA and a few other funds to make their art. Some of those artists would even be the abstract expressionists, right? Now, there were different offices throughout the United States, right? In the Midwest, it was in Chicago, and there was a whole school of regionalism that was developing out there. But in New York, we were the artists were lucky enough to have Bergen Diller, who was an abstract artist, as being the director, and he was promoting more more forms of modern art than you would see in some of the other regions of the United States. So this is why the New York School formed here. A lot of these people were in some way related, or sometimes on the payroll of the WPA under Bergen Diller. Now, some other things that helped promote modernism in the second quarter of the 20th century would be the opening of the Museum of Modern Art in 1929, followed by the Guggenheim Museum a decade later. Now, this allowed artists in New York to see the works of the most modern and contemporary works that were being produced in Europe at that time. Robert Delaunay, he's considered an orphist from France. And if you were to examine the holdings early on, especially of Moma and the Guggenheim, you would find that the Moma has more of a French bias to it, and the Guggenheim had more of a German bias to it. So artists like Wesley Kandinsky are highly represented in the Guggenheim, while they weren't in MoMA. Kandinsky is considered the artist who first brought us non-representational work. In examples like this, when we talk about women in 2 weeks, we'll mention some other artists who were there maybe before he was. It's always been a bone of contention who was the first non-representational artist. But anyway, these were the artists that the abstract expressionists were able to see because of the openings of their museums. Along with that were the surrealists. And the surrealists, besides being non-representational, added something to the abstract expressionist concept, which was called automatism. Right? Automatism is essentially a concept of letting non-conscious actions form the basis for an artwork. So in the automatic drawing, Andre Masson would have perhaps not even looked at the paper and just moved his hand around and captured this rhythmic flow to it, right? And you can see some elements, you can see two hands in there, but the overall composition breaks down. Right. So this automatism was practiced by a number of different artists in a number of different ways. In another work by Masson, the Battle of Fishes, he began by pouring glue on the canvas. And in each pouring of glue, he had some colored sand, which he then threw on top of the glue, right? After he did that, like most surrealists at this point, they would look at what was started and start to make sense of it. So in this particular work, you can see the fish were added, drawn into this random composition. It's important to understand that the surrealists looked at automatism as a beginning, but not as an end. It was a way into a composition, but they never really felt like it could be unadjusted, right? It needed to be a starting point, but not a end point. So another surrealist who was important for the abstract expressionists, and by now, with World War II already on, in the 1930s, these artists were coming to the United States. Many of the surrealists, the Dadaists, the abstract painters lived in Germany, and they didn't want to have anything to do with the Nazis. And some of them would first go to France, and then they would find that France was under the Vichy government, and they had to leave there. So lots of artists kind of left Europe and came to the United States. These artists were a generation older than the abstract expressionists, and they were revered by the abstract expressionists. So they were in the 1930s, very important to the development of those artists. Juan Miró, right, is important. Each one of these works presents something that is different and important in the development of abstract expressionism. In Constellation from 1940, Miró did something that very few artists ever did before, and that was allow the composition to feel like it just went on, and it wasn't composed within the borders of the work. Even when an artwork would have been cut and trimmed, like the work on the right, it still feels like it's composed in a finite space. But with something like Constellations, right, we get the sense of an expansiveness that could go on, and we call these overall paintings or field paintings, and that will be very important to the development of abstract expressionism. Miró was, had a sense of humor too, and he created this creature called Lop Lop. And if you look carefully to the redder section towards the center of the creature, you'll see a bird's head, and it's kind of resting on what looks like a second bird's head, or the neck of a second bird. One has more color to it, the other is more gray. So Lop Lop, and as a matter of fact, if this is a good picture because now I see 3 birds' heads in there. But the one creature, Lop Lop, was a character that Miró used over and over again. In fact, there is a sculpture on the back street of Moma. What would that be, 54th Street? And it's a sculpture of the bird Lop Lop. Right. So what is Lop Lop doing here? Lop Lop is painting, right? Surrealism in painting, right? And it looks like this creature is making the painting on the right. Now, to make the painting on the right, with the painting within the painting, Miró did something that was based on automatism. He took a can of paint, he tied it to a string, and he punched a hole in the bottom of it so the paint would pour out, right? And then he took the string and he just swung it back and forth across the painting, right? So, yeah, I mean, this could be considered drip painting. It's certainly automatism, but in 1942, Miró had this sense of letting this spontaneous accident be part of his composition, right? It's important to note that right now it's just within the painting within the painting, and we'll even see some more of that in Pollock's work. Another artist who was influential on the abstract expressionists is Diego Rivera, right? What did Diego Rivera have to offer to these people since his work is representational? Well, Diego Rivera worked big. Right, his works were the murals, right? These large murals, and they had an impact based on their scale. And the abstract expressionists would take over that sense of scale and work very large afterwards. This painting has an interesting history, Man at the Crossroads. This is not the original. He repainted this painting. It was first made for Rockefeller's building in Rockefeller Center, right? And he commissioned Diego Rivera, who was one of the most important muralists at the time, to make a painting. Diego Rivera made this painting and included in it some people who, like this person here, who is Trotsky, right? He included some of his heroes in this work, and Rockefeller didn't like the idea of Diego Rivera putting communists or socialists or whatever you wanted to call them. They were definitely anti-capitalists into this painting. And Rockefeller asked Diego Rivera to paint out those people who he found disquieting. And Diego Rivera said, "There's no way I can do that." Right? And so Rockefeller said, "Okay, consider yourself finished and paid, and now the painting is mine." And he went and he tore it down. Right, so that's the sad story of the Diego Rivera in New York City. By the way, Detroit still has some of his works, some of his murals hanging up in it. Okay, you see David Cisqueros over here, and here's a work by David Cisqueros. Cisqueros was also a Mexican muralist, although he was not able to ever execute a mural in the United States. The reason being was if Diego Rivera was political, Cisqueros was off the charts, right? And nobody would take a chance on putting a mural up that he had created, right? So anyway, this is an easel painting that you could see at MoMA, Echo of a Scream, 1937. It's based on the Sino-Japanese War, one of that in the Spanish Civil War were two of the precursors to World War II. Right? But Cisqueros kept a studio in New York City. And in that studio, he often gave lessons, and many of the people who would grow to be the abstract expressionists or who were already grown but wanted to learn new techniques came to David Cisqueros and worked there. And he used many, many forms of experimentalism in making his paintings. He was not above whatever it took to get the surface that he wanted. So he was an important teacher to the abstract expressionists. And of course, in 1939, this work visited New York City. And the Guernica we've talked about before is one of the few works of Pablo Picasso's that is blatantly political, and it's a protest against the regime that conquered the Republic of Spain and was a fascist government that ruled from 1937 to when Franco died, I believe around 1980, right? So Picasso had made this painting just prior to Franco's taking charge of the country, and he used some techniques that the Germans would come to know as blitzkrieg. So Picasso was very upset that they were used on his fellow Spaniards. So he made this painting, but it could never be shown in Spain, obviously, and it was brought to France, and France then was falling under the Vichy's, so it had to be moved away from France as well. It went to England, and then it came to the United States, and it was first seen at MoMA in 1939, and it had a profound effect on most people who saw it, and especially on the abstract expressionist. It's an enormous canvas, and it is powerful, and you can feel the energy in Picasso in it. There's no sense of holding back in the making of this. You can feel his like anger and aggression and the swiping at the canvas when you get to look at it. And those are some of the things that the abstract expressionist responded to. Well, there are other influences as well on the abstract expressionists. They were interested in existential philosophy, Jungian psychology. The idea of archetypes and collective unconsciousness is very important to them, and they used mythology, the Eastern religions and philosophy, and, religion and philosophy. One person's philosophy is another person's religion, essentially, right? So all of those kind of fit together. But the Native American and the Polynesian art were things that were, the sand paintings that would be temporary, and the process of making them that was more important than the actual finish of it was important. The idea from Jung of archetypes is especially important when we start to look at work that is no longer representational, right? This work still has a sense of mythology in it and the archetypal myths that we'll see in some of these works, but as they become more and more abstracted, the idea of connecting on a level that is not conscious becomes more and more important in their work. An artist who came from Germany who was very important to the abstract expressionists, Hans Hoffman, right? You can see his work from 1946. It has the spontaneity that they were all looking for, but this is a later work and he had been doing it for a long time. Hans Hoffman had been a teacher in the Bauhaus in Germany, and he left in the early 30s when the Nazis started to raise their heads up, and came to New York, where he became a teacher in the early 30s. He would end up going to Black Mountain College and working with John Cage and being the teacher for another generation of artists, including Robert Rauschenberg. But in this early period here, you can see that he's very much interested in what would become action and gesture painting. And here's another one of his works. So you can see that this spontaneity is already happening in the work in the early 1940s in some of the emigre artists. Another artist who slightly predates the abstract expressionists is Arshad Gorky, right? And he lived a short life because at 43 he committed suicide. I put one of his early works up here because it's very famous, and one of his later works, so we can see his body of work here. But the early work is biographical, and as a boy, he was living in Turkey, and he was Armenian and had to. They were kicked out of the country. Right. And so he and his mother, his father had already left, had to walk out of Turkey, and his mother was giving him all of the food, and she ended up starving and never made it out of the country. And he had to finish the trip by himself. So he painted her as if she was disappearing, that she's not substantial in there. And this stayed with him his entire life. And eventually it was the cause of his suicide. So this later work that we're looking at here, The Liver is a Coxcomb, looks a lot like what you might see from automatism or early abstract expressionism. It feels very spontaneous, and it looks very spontaneous, but that's not the way it was actually painted, but it gives that impression of spontaneity, and that was so important for the artist who he was actually working with at this time, but he did not survive into the heyday of abstract expressionism. What do we have here? Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to follow the development of Jackson Pollock from the beginning of his career, right? And then I'm going to take another look, maybe a little bit more briefly, at Mark Rothko, right? So we're going to spend some time, and we're really going to get deep down into how Jackson Pollock became the artist that he was, how he developed that technique. And one of the important things, when we think of Jackson Pollock, we think about motion and movement in being so important to him. And one of his teachers was Thomas Hart Benton. Right? Now, Jackson Pollock grew up in California, and then started moving east. Along the way, he became a student of Thomas Hart Benton before settling in New York. Well, actually, Benton might have even been teaching in New York by that time. Benton spent some time making the New School murals, so he had been in New York. But Benton, who had been trained as a modernist, as time went on, just like Grant Wood, pulled further and further back away from modernism. And at one point he reached a work like this, The Ballad of the Jealous Lovers. Right. So in this picture, the three forward people are actually singing the song, and they're narrating the story that you see behind them. And you can see all of this energy of movement in the landscape in there. And as you can look, when you compare it to his students' work, Jackson Pollock, you can see that same sense of motion in the going west, right? So it's another narrative. He was very much taken by the work of Thomas Hart Benton when he made these paintings. And not only was he taken with them, but Benton was a fan of Jackson Pollock as well too. And the man playing the harmonica in the lower center of the painting is a portrait of Jackson Pollock. So anyway, Jackson Pollock's early work can be associated with the regionalism of the Midwest, and as opposed to the urbanism of New York at that time. So what happens to him? He comes to New York, right? And he comes to New York at the same time that New York is being flooded with these modern artists from around the world. Here we see a work by Wilfredo Lamb, who actually spent more time in Cuba after leaving Europe. But the reason why I show you this work is Wilfredo Lamb was very much interested in Afro-Cubist religions, and totemism is an important aspect of it. And we look at all these totemic figures, you know, and then we see in the work by Pollock from approximately the same time. And you also see in the Moon Woman this very totemic figure, right? So what's happening in Jackson Pollock's work now is he's moving away from the regionalism. Well, he's moved away from it already, right? He's moved away from the regionalism of Thomas Hart Benton, right, into this world of mythology, and with that, the idea of the collective unconscious. The people who were studying myth at that time saw a myth as almost like an individual has a dream, a people has a myth, right? It's something that is deeply embedded in their subconsciousness, right? So through studying Carl Jung, he became very much interested in the theories of the collective unconscious. I might say here that the reason why he started studying Jung was because he had been an alcoholic, and he was going to therapy for his alcoholism, and he was introduced to Carl Jung through the therapy that he was taking for his alcoholism. So some of the other works that you can see, Pollock is always going to be on the right. On the left is another surrealist, Andre Masson, and he's the one who did the automatic drawing. And he did the same kind of work on this piece over here, Pasiphae. And we can see that another sample painting by Pollock called Pasiphae. Pasiphae is a Greek myth about a woman who is raped by Zeus, right? Pasiphae is the woman, right? So you can see both of these paintings are like very hard to read. Their imagery is deeply buried in abstraction, coming from slightly different places though, but you can see that Pollock is in the same kind of mindset as the surrealist at this point. And now, besides surrealism, there was this other type of work that was being produced, and at some point, even Picasso's work, he was asked by the surrealists to join them, but Picasso said, "No, I don't need to be part of any group," right? Or maybe he was listening to Groucho Marx and was thinking, "I don't want to be part of any group that would invite me." So anyway, a painting by Picasso, Painter and Model, from 1928. Again, we see those those heads that are very totemic, very abstracted. And what's interesting is that Picasso has the painter painting a picture, and if you notice that within the canvas, you see the most realistic element in the entire composition, right? The silhouette of the face that the artist is drawing from the model, right? Well, it's these totemic figures and this sense of space that we see in Pollock's male and female from this time. And again, the Jungian ideas as well as the space are important here, right? The Guardian of the Secrets from 1943. 43 is a pretty important year for this and another painting. In the Guardians of the Secrets, it's kind of hard to discern what is going on in here. Seems like we're cut off on the top a little bit, but there's a dog who is under a table, and there are some totemic figures on the right and left and above, and they're surrounding a table, and on that table is what looks as random as everything else is. We can still see representation in it, but on the table is pure non-representational marking, right? And perhaps these guardians are the secret of this non-representational, this which could be an entry into the unconscious, right? So this is a work from Pollock in 1943. In 1943, he also had a commission from Peggy Guggenheim to make a large canvas, and this is essentially the largest he ever made. It's 20 feet across, and in this one, he had a hard time figuring out what to do, and eventually he just started going with the flow, and you're seeing it really is just about the fluidity and the rhythm of the painting. Any imagery is embedded deeply within it. You could hardly make anything out, and he wasn't really interested in it at that time. But after 1943, he didn't make a totally non-objective painting again for another 3 years, right? So this is a one-off until 1946, right? So in 1946, he had continued working as he had, and we can see this work just on the border of non-representational imagery. The circumcision is being performed by this creature in the center over here, right? And you could hardly make out where the circumcision is happening. Perhaps this is the poor victim below. But anyway, we're at the edge of representation here, and there's very minimal representation, and gesture is becoming more and more important to Jackson Pollock. Now, in the same year, he makes this painting, right? Shimmering Substance in 1946. Herb Rosenberg later will remember this period of time for Pollock and some of the other artists as the time when the canvas became an arena for spontaneous gestures, right? So no longer was it a picture, right? But it was an event. It was a recording of an event rather than an object brought in from the outside world, right? And Shimmering Substance is important. It might not have been his very first work like this, but it might have been his very last like this, for the particular reason that it was probably his last easel painting, at least for a number of years, right? He was painting on an easel, and he was making these gestures and putting the paint on and moving and flowing as he put the paint on. And of course, you can imagine how sloppy the process was. So there was a lot of spatter on the floor. When he finished this painting, he had two criticisms of it. One was that very big yellow arc that you can see. He was disappointed in having that in there because that showed his arm, right? So he felt that as a representation of the arm, in its movement, and he felt like that was limiting, right? And he didn't want to, so you could imagine a person standing in front of this canvas and reaching out, and the yellow as he puts it on, you can imagine your arm moving around like that, right? So that he found was a limitation. But then when he backed away from it and looked down, he saw the floor. And he said, wow, I like that floor, right? So the next painting he made was not on an easel. He went out to his barn and he made his first of the drip paintings. Right. So in 1947, we see Pollock leave easels behind, work directly on the floor, work in a almost like a dance from all sides of the canvas. He's not trying to make a picture. He's just responding to what is there already and layering things upon it and really entering into a dance with the canvas. I think that's the best way of describing it. You know, you don't want to look at it and try to find imagery. You just want to move with it. So Pollock started doing these paintings in 1947. And he continued working purely on his floor. If you go out to Springs, you can see his barn where he painted, and you can even see some of the drips that were left behind during these paintings. They're very large paintings. They're not 20 feet, but they could be 12 feet across, 10 feet across, 8 feet high. You know, they're pretty large paintings, right? And so he's working on these kind of paintings. Here's an example of him working on a painting in Springs, and he'll take a big can of paint and he'll take a very loose brush and he'll just start to fling and spatter the paint on there, and it's just flowing off of his brush. Now this is the first layer, and it's not like he's going to be totally random, because as he works layer upon layer, he's responding to what's beneath it, right? So his movements are based on what's already on the canvas after he starts. You can find in some of these embedded footprints, handprints, cigarette butts, all the things that were involved in his personal process as he was making it. So these are some of his paintings, and you can see there's different density in them. There's different senses of movement in them. And he had been working on these paintings for, you know, at this point he was in his 4th year of making these paintings, and he was already considered the greatest painter in the United States, and he was selling his paintings. He was like really the it person. He was, you know, in the art world, he was everybody's darling. He wasn't especially a social type of person. You know, he was more taciturn and quiet, so it was kind of tough. And his wife ended up doing most of the talking for him. We'll talk about her in just a moment. But he had been making these paintings for years, and he's caught in this place where the expectation is that he would continue on and on making these paintings, and they were flying out of the gallery. Everybody wanted to have a Jackson Pollock, right? And that went on for a few years, right? So for about 4 years, he had to stay in the moment. He couldn't back off from his painting at all. He had to pour himself into it, right? So here in 1952, we start to see a little something different happen. And we're starting to see with the blue poles, this idea of a hierarchy coming back to their composition, right? Before it was pure field, and this may be considered pure field too, but the space is more structured because of the idea of having those blue shapes against everything else. So the idea of doing that put him back into mind of a figure ground composition, right? Something that he hadn't done in many years. Now, as he's making these paintings, they're starting to change. The gallery is that is representing him is starting to feel like nervous, because the paintings are changing and people want the old ones, and he's making these paintings in 1953, and all of a sudden they become less and less like what a Jackson Pollock should look like. They look a lot like what he did earlier, but not what people wanted to see. and they became almost to the point of representational again. And he was having a very hard time with his gallery. He started drinking again. And the very last painting he made was Portrait and Dream in 1953, right? So here he is, like, disassociating himself with the abstraction on the left, right? The last 3 years of his life, he sunk deep into alcoholism. He had separated from his wife, and he ended up killing himself and a passenger in a car in 1956, driving while intoxicated. So although in 1950 he was on the top of the world, by 1956 he had a tragic end. And I think part of that had to do with being forced to stay in that non-objective space and not being able to come out of what essentially is the subconscious, right? So he was embedded in that. Now let's look at Mark Rothko, whose work takes a completely different turn, right? Mark Rothko's work is noted for his broad bands of color, the lushness of the color, and no print, no digital image ever does justice to what his works, his mature works look like, because he puts layer upon layer of color on here, and you can hardly see it at all. In the white, you can see a little bit of it, but sometimes there's warm blues and cool blues, or cool reds and warm reds, and the colors kind of dance together, and you can hardly even see it in one of these prints, or rather digital images. Well, to go back in his career to where he started working as a mature artist, we see he's an urban realist in the 1930s. And looking at two of his paintings from 1937, the one thing that you see in them is the prevalence of rectangular composition, right? You can see that deeply embedded in these two realistic works is rectangles. Just like movement was important in the early work by Pollock, the rectangular hierarchy of the painting is very important to Mark Rothko. Now let's see what happens when he too reaches into the 1940s. Well, we see that he too becomes involved in this animism, the mythology, the collective unconscious, the Jungian types of thought processes. And here's one of his works. But if you notice that he still composes this image within the bands of a rectangular structure. Following year, we can still see some of the surrealism in these works from 1945. Ignore the hierarchical bird. I forgot to erase this. Both of these works are from a series called The Rights of Lilith from 1945. But you can see that from the left to the right, it's almost like the image is dissolving, right? It's becoming less and less hard to discern the objects in his painting. And as we move through the later 1940s, we can see his work reach a point he started making the multiforms actually in 1945. So he passes out of this stage of the edge of representation into pure non-representational work. And we have the example from 1948 of number 1, right? Where we seem to see just a sea of colors floating randomly, without any sense of organization in them. And then when you look at 1949 and the Untitled, you can see he's starting to bring back a little bit of the structure. You're starting to see some more horizontality take over in this work. And before the year is out, he's making his first of what we would see as a Mark Rothko in 1949. And he'll keep on working like that for the remainder of his career. Right, so we can see 1961, and I put up I'm sorry, this is not an untitled multiform. I didn't erase that part. This is just an image of him working on one of his paintings. You can see the scale that he works on, and you can see that, well, even though he's working on a big area of color, he doesn't need to use a big brush because he wants to break that color up and have the brush strokes visible and have the layering of color show up in there. So what might seem to be an easy solution by making this big broad area of blue is actually one where he has built up layer and layer of color within that blue, right? Again, oil paint has a way of reflecting light so you can see into it. So you really have to see these works in person to get the full sense of that. But what you can see is that it's so big that if you were to stand in front of it, it'd be like you were falling into the work, right? Falling into this work, just like Jackson Pollock and all these other people. The scale is big on purpose because your peripheral vision is not outside of the painting, and you're just buried inside the painting, right? So you become really connected to the painting because of the scale. So towards the end of his life, he got to design the Rothko Chapel. He had been working on it for a number of years. It did not get installed until after he passed away. He had a tragic end as well, too. In 1970, he committed suicide. I think, again, these are artists who keep themselves in this space of the unconscious for so much time, become very brittle. Right, and just like Jackson Pollock fell back to alcohol, Mark Rothko took his life, his own life. I had a professor in graduate school, circa 1982. His name was Gustin, and he was a friend of Mark Rothko's, and he told the story of bringing Mark Rothko into Hunter College in like 1969 to see if hanging out with young people would lift his spirits, but it didn't, and he ended up taking his life. So there are a lot of other people, and I don't want to I couldn't spend as much time on all of them. They have similar stories. Lee Krasner, wife of Jackson Pollock, was an artist in her own right as long as Jackson Pollock, and they were both equally professional when they met, right? And her background goes back to constructivism and the geometric abstraction. And so we can see one of her works from 1940, The Seated Nude, just like her husband, she was following that trail into non-representational work, into automatism. She did something with her life, though, around this period of time, recognizing that her husband's career was becoming really dominating. She decided to ease back on her work for a while and help develop his career at this very crucial period of time when he was becoming so famous. So she kind of sacrificed some years of her life, and perhaps Jackson Pollock wouldn't have been as famous as he was if it wasn't for Lee Krasner. But she certainly did sacrifice some of her career for a man who ended up cheating on her. So it's like, bad choice, Lee. Bad choice, Lee. Well, anyway, she, by 1960, he was dead. She was completely free of him and was back to working on her own work again. And at some point, she brought back a lot of the geometry that came from the early part of her career. Well, there's a lot of these artists. William De Kooning, you could say that the story of William De Kooning is based on the figure coming in and out of his work, right? So in the 1940s, De Kooning is one of those people who in this country, who today would be in some kind of camp because he come to the United States illegally by jumping ship. and settling in New York and New Jersey and becoming a house painter, right? He was a trained artist, but he couldn't do any of that stuff early in his career, right? So we're into the 1940s BC before we see his work, and we see these figurative works that he's making that are just almost like they're just trying to hold on to their form. And by 1945, we see that the figure is kind of dissolving into space. By 1950, the figure is essentially gone, right? But you can see little tiny bits of what might be an eye and teeth and little elements of the figure hold up through 1950, right? But actually, this is in reverse, because this is him coming back to the figure after the 1948 work. Or 1947 work. He did a series of these black paintings where the figure is essentially disappeared. And then we start to see the re-establishment of body parts, and those body parts go on to become figures again in his work, in these famous works from the 1950s, the Women's series. And then they start to disappear again. And throughout his entire career, he'll come back to figuration and rotate, swing back and forth between figuration and pure non-objective work. And sometimes when there is figuration, it's almost like it's almost not there. One of the things about De Kooning's work is that he would spend a lot of time in front of a painting, and he would spend almost as much time taking paint off as putting it on. So he would scrape away, and, it's that wax on, wax off thing. His style was lay some paint on, take some paint off, lay some paint on, take some paint off. And one of the jokes about De Kooning was a painting was not finished until somebody took it out of his studio, because if he had a chance, he would go and work on it some more. So the Pirate from 1980 is essentially non-figurative, but for him, he was looking at a figure in there. Barnett Newman is another interesting character who, like De Kooning, didn't have that long a career, and his problem was that during the Depression, he had a job, right? Where all of the other people were working on through the WPA and such. Barnett Newman was educated enough that he could get a job as a teacher. So he did a lot of teaching and wasn't able to make a lot of paintings at the same time as these other people were. So when we see his work, it's almost fully formed already. And we see these two pieces, the circle being the symbol of unity is very important to him. They're very abstracted, but they still have, this idea of in their titles, a relationship to mythology. But that disappears rapidly in 1948, when the symbol of unity becomes one-mint in his first of these zip paintings that he makes in 1948, right? And it's all about that, the concentration of focus into this linear element that, that flows, that lives on top of the canvas, right? So this is where Barnett Newman is. And after the one-mint, well, you can't keep on making a painting with one line in it, so he started to make them with multiple lines in it, right? As you can see in the yellow painting from 1949. And then there's the interplay of space that gets created by the density of the lines themselves. In one of his most famous paintings, Vir Heroicus Sublimis, right? We see it's very large, and you can stand in front of it and be totally absorbed in the canvas. And these elements of linearity would just be flickering on the edges of your sight. He created the Stations of the Cross a little bit later, and what's important about these pieces is that Barnett Newman isn't purely thinking about non-objectivity when he makes his works, and he's thinking about relationship, and he uses the element of the line to be part of a relationship that you might end up becoming, having with another being, right? So the Stations of the Cross is, although Barnett Newman was Jewish, he was fascinated with the story of Jesus's last days and the series of paintings or sculptures that describe the end of his life. And what he ended up doing was turning each one of them into a different uh, non-representational painting that captures the relationships inside the Stations of the Cross. Kind of an interesting idea. Well, there are a number of other artists that work in this manner, some of them more gestural, some of them more color filled. Franz Klein, these are big paintings. You would think that he's using an 8-inch brush to do this, but he doesn't. He kind of paints with a small brush to make it look like they're big, and he has a sense of calligraphy about them. Helen Frankenthaler, of course, we mentioned earlier, she did something unique at this point, which was to water the paint down until it became a wash. And she essentially made 10-foot long watercolor washes out of oil paint and stain, right, on unprimed canvas. So she's much younger than this other group and usually is put with the next generation, but I wanted to make sure she got a little bit of due here for what she did in those years. Other women that were involved in the group, Elaine De Kooning and Grace Hartigan, both representational. And Robert Motherwell, who I mentioned before, whose work looks very abstract, the Elegy to the Spanish Republic, but in reality, it has a lot of deep meaning to it. A little bit of the clue you get from it is from looking at this earlier piece, Pancho Villa, Dead and Alive, right? And we see he's using this muted color palette here. His interest is in Latin American politics, and we see all that stuff happening there. But then he becomes enamored with the story of the Spanish Civil War, and he paints image after image of these. You can see this is number 34, where these big blots seem to be voiding out what could be a colorful surface beneath them, and the big blots end up representing the fascist government of General Franco. And Clifford still has this sense of channeling the Chinese landscape painting in his. He comes from the Northwest. Gottlieb did a series of pictographs, but he's where they seem to be some kind of sacred language in there, and then he became focused on these elements of floating forms that carried him through his entire later career. Philip Gustin is an interesting character, and he too was one of those action painters, and his action was pretty much like plus and minus. He would make horizontal and cross them with vertical lines, and almost every mark was a slash that was either horizontal or vertical, and he would build up the work towards the center. But after a while, he became disillusioned with non-representational painting, and he started making representational painting again. We see the artist studio on the bottom left, very rough, and then the roughness becomes internalized in the studio in 1969 when we get this gruesome character making the painting, right? And then later on, the random shoes and body parts of the pit from later on. He was considered a sellout for adding representation back to his work. And then by the 1970s, he was considered a father of the neo-expressionist movement. So go figure, right? You make what you do, and you can't let other people tell you why to make it, right? Ad Reinhardt is a little bit younger than many of these, and he came to his style a little bit later. But what you can see in looking at the yellow painting is that he's very much interested in monochrome. And by 1952, he's created this series of paintings that are very much simple geometric forms in monochrome that come near to the, they kind of blend together. Right now, they're still a little bit easier to see, but a little bit later, he reaches the point where the paintings are almost totally solid color, usually black. And what he does is he divides them into 9 squares and paints them in different blacks. So you can end up, even though every one of them is a black, there's slight variations, and you can see the structure. Oftentimes, you would not even see this unless you looked at it pretty hard. And I don't know whether you can all see it, but there is this structure that he puts in there. For Reinhardt at this point, it's not about him becoming, it's about you becoming visual, this becoming visible to you. So it's not from the act of painting to, we've moved to the act of seeing, right? And he's asking us to do the work and uncover the image within it. I have just a couple more. I actually have about 20 more, but I put them in the second PowerPoint, and they're all for the things that followed after. So I'm going to let you all go in just a minute. A couple of sculptors who worked with the abstract expressionist or around the abstract expressionist include 2 people who were constructed their works intuitively. Even less so Joseph Cornell, more so Louise Nevelson, who built these boxes up by finding random pieces of wood and just hammering them together until she had a form, and then she would turn them white, right? Or blue or black or gold or silver. They would become unified, but originally they were boxes that she just kind of intuitively tacked together. It's very hard for someone to make sculpture as intuitively as a painter could paint on a canvas, right? Because the materials aren't as fluid, right? And David Smith became one of the artists, sculptors most closely associated with the New York school. And if you look at the upper right, you can see a work that goes back to the earlier period of Cubo-Surrealism, right? And then the royal bird brings him into the mythological period. And so he's following the same trajectory as the sculptors do. And then automatism develops into a piece called The Letter, in which he kind of is very spontaneous in building each of these elements and then putting them together into this hierarchic form. He made totems as well in the 1950s, and then he's most noted for the series QB. Now, the QB series, he actually created by building up cardboard boxes, putting them together, and then after he had a form that he was interested in, he would go back and fabricate them. Well, there were a lot of artists who followed after the abstract expressionists. There's some I hadn't even got to yet. They left a very big wake, and a lot of artists moving in different directions filled in. Robert Rauschenberg can have some, he looked at the abstract expressionists. Color field people like Ellsworth Kelly are just a little bit younger and fit into this. And even things like Happenings by Alan Capro. They're all in the other set of slides, I'm sorry. Right? Where he actually put action, the action was the work itself at that point. So there's things to look at beyond here, but I think I'm going to have to stop for today. I think last time I stayed for an hour and a half, and I can't go. I'm using up my welcome, so I'm going to stop here. Next week, we're moving to the evening for July. Apparently, too many people like to be outside in the summertime. Well, I don't know why. Diana, I see you're outside. Good for you. Right. I'm inside and I want to go out. So we're going to be moving to the evening. And next week, in the rotation, I will be talking to an artist that we've shown, a really fascinating person, Dr. Catherine Coe, who was a neurosurgeon who became a master of fine arts after being a neurosurgeon. She has an interesting story to tell and some very unique work. So we'll look at her. And the following week, you see Eileen down here. I'm very excited. I'm going to be sharing the platform with another curator. And it's going to be Eileen, and together we're going to do 2 sessions where we talk about women in the visual arts. I've been having